The neighborhood was peaceful, a cluster of identical houses with neatly trimmed lawns and a sense of order. Among the residents was a young boy, barely into his teenage years, whose days were filled with school, chores, and moments of quiet observation. He wasn't particularly outgoing. Instead, he found comfort in the solitude of his room or the corners of the yard where he could watch the world unfold at a distance. It was from one such corner that he first noticed her. She lived 2 houses down, a woman in her mid-30s who exuded a charm that seemed to captivate everyone around her. She carried herself with a grace that felt effortless, whether she was tending to her garden, greeting neighbors, or simply sitting on her porch with a book. The boy didn't know much about her, but he didn't need to. To him, she was an enigma, a figure who seemed to glow with an inexplicable allure. The boy's curiosity began innocently enough. He would glance at her yard as he walked past or peek from his window when she was outside. She wasn't like anyone he knew. There was a warmth to her interactions with others, yet she seemed distant at times, as if carrying a weight she didn't show. The more he observed, the more he wanted to understand. One afternoon, while playing outside, he overheard raised voices coming from her direction. He couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable. An argument. It was a side of her he hadn't seen before. She always seemed composed, almost untouchable. Yet here she was, vulnerable and human. The moment lingered in his mind, planting a seed of intrigue that began to grow with each passing day. As weeks went by, his observations became more deliberate. He wasn't entirely sure why he was so drawn to her, but it felt as though there was something he needed to uncover. She fascinated him, not just because of her beauty or the way she carried herself, but because she seemed to live in a world far more complex than his own. Her life felt like a puzzle, and he couldn't resist the urge to piece it together. The boy knew it was wrong to watch her so closely, but he justified it to himself. He wasn't harming anyone. He wasn't intruding, at least not in a way that felt significant to him. Still, a sense of guilt tugged at the edges of his thoughts. He didn't want to be seen as a spy or a creep, yet he couldn't stop himself. It was as if he was drawn to her by an invisible thread, one that he didn't know how to sever. The tipping point came on a quiet evening when he saw her sitting on her porch, staring into the distance. She looked different, almost sad. Something about the moment felt intimate, and yet he couldn't look away. He didn't know it yet, but this fascination of his would soon lead to a moment that would change the way he saw her, and himself, forever. The boy's curiosity had reached a point where mere glances from a distance no longer satisfied him. The questions in his mind multiplied with each passing day, and his imagination filled the gaps his observations could not. He convinced himself that what he was doing wasn't harmful. He wasn't interfering. He was simply looking, trying to understand. But deep down, a small voice reminded him of the boundaries he was crossing. It was late one afternoon when he decided to act. He waited for her to return home from work, carefully noting the time she usually arrived. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, he slipped out of his house and positioned himself behind the hedge that bordered her yard. From there, he had a clear view of her living room window. He crouched low, his heart pounding in his chest, a mixture of nervousness and anticipation washing over him. She appeared minutes later, carrying a grocery bag in one hand and her phone in the other. She moved with her usual grace, but the boy noticed something different. Her shoulders seemed tense, and her face carried a weariness that hadn't been there before. He watched as she placed the bag on the kitchen counter and took a deep breath, pausing for a moment as if trying to gather herself. The boy felt a pang of guilt as he watched her, but he couldn't bring himself to stop. He saw her phone light up with a call, her expression softening slightly as she answered. Her voice was muffled, but he could hear the warmth in her tone, a stark contrast to the tension he'd noticed earlier. The conversation ended quickly, and she set the phone down, glancing briefly toward the window. The boy froze, pressing himself deeper into the shadows. His breath caught in his throat. Over the next few days, the boy returned to his hiding spot, always careful not to be seen. He watched her routine, the way she moved through her home, the moments when she seemed lost in thought, and the occasional laughter that escaped her lips when she spoke on the phone. But there were other moments too. Moments when she appeared distracted, her eyes distant as if weighed down by something he couldn't understand. One evening, as he hid behind the hedge, he noticed something unusual. She wasn't alone. A man had joined her, and their conversation seemed tense. The boy couldn't hear much, but their body language told a story. The man gestured emphatically, while she stood with her arms crossed, her face a mask of restrained emotion. The argument ended abruptly when the man stormed out, leaving her standing alone in the dimly lit room. The boy's fascination deepened. He began to create stories in his mind, imagining what could have caused the tension between her and the man. He felt as though he was uncovering a mystery, piecing together fragments of her life that no one else seemed to notice. But his curiosity blinded him to the line he was crossing. The night he was caught came unexpectedly. He had returned to his usual spot, watching as she sat in her living room with a glass of wine, the light from the television flickering across her face. She seemed more relaxed than usual, her earlier tension replaced by a quiet calm. The boy shifted slightly to get a better view, accidentally rustling the leaves around him. She turned sharply toward the sound, her eyes narrowing as she stepped closer to the window. The boy's heart raced as he realized his mistake. Before he could react, the back door opened, and her voice cut through the night. "Who's there?" In that moment, the boy's world seemed to collapse. He stayed frozen in place, unable to move or speak as she stepped closer, her figure silhouetted against the light from the house. When her gaze landed on him, her expression shifted from suspicion to shock, and then to something he couldn't quite decipher. He knew there was no way to explain himself, no excuse that could justify what he had done. She stared at him for what felt like an eternity, her eyes sharp and unyielding. The boy, trembling, tried to summon the courage to say something, but the words caught in his throat. She stepped closer, crossing her arms, and demanded an explanation. Her voice wasn't loud, but it carried a weight that made him feel small. "I'm sorry," he finally stammered, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to," he stopped, realizing how hollow his words sounded. What could he possibly say to make this better? He looked down at the ground, unable to meet her gaze. Her expression softened slightly as she noticed his trembling hands and tear-filled eyes. She sighed and asked, more gently this time, "Why were you spying on me?" There was no anger in her tone now, only curiosity mixed with a hint of disappointment. The boy took a deep breath, trying to explain himself. He admitted that he had been curious about her, that she seemed so different from everyone else. He talked about how he often saw her smiling and kind, but then he overheard arguments or caught glimpses of her looking sad. He didn't understand why, and his curiosity had spiraled out of control. "I wasn't trying to hurt you," he said, his voice cracking. I wanted to know more about you." She listened quietly, her arms still crossed, but her posture relaxed. His honesty, though uncomfortable, seemed to reach her. "You know," she said after a moment, "there's a difference between curiosity and crossing someone's boundaries. What you did, it's not okay." The boy nodded quickly, his head hanging in shame. "I know," he said. "I'm so sorry. I wasn't thinking. I didn't know how to stop." She let out another sigh and sat down on the steps of her porch, motioning for him to sit as well. Reluctantly, he did, keeping his distance. "Look," she began, "I get that you're young and you're still figuring things out. But what you've done is invasive. My life, my struggles, they're private. Everyone has parts of their life they don't share with others, and that's okay. It doesn't mean you're entitled to see them." Her words stung, but the boy nodded again. He felt a lump in his throat, but he forced himself to listen. She wasn't yelling at him or being cruel. She was explaining, trying to help him understand. After a moment she added, "You're not a bad kid. Can see that. But you have to learn to respect people's privacy. If you're curious about someone, talk to them. Ask questions. Don't hide in the shadows and assume you'll get the answers you're looking for. Her words hung in the air, and the boy felt the full weight of his actions. He had hurt someone he admired, even if he hadn't intended to. I promise, he said quietly, I won't do it again. Ever. She looked at him for a long moment, then nodded. Good. But promises aren't just words, they're actions. Make sure you mean it. He nodded earnestly, his chest heavy with remorse. She stood up and gave him one last look, her expression a mix of sternness and understanding. Go home, she said softly. Think about what we talked about. The boy stood and walked away, his mind racing with everything she had said. It wasn't just about getting caught. It was about learning a lesson he hadn't even realized he needed. And though he felt ashamed, he also felt grateful. The boy couldn't sleep that night. Her words echoed in his mind, each one cutting deeper as he replayed the encounter. He thought about the moments he had spent watching her, the justifications he had made for his actions, and how wrong they now felt in hindsight. For the first time, he truly understood how his curiosity had crossed into something harmful. Over the following days, he kept his distance. He avoided looking toward her house, and when he saw her in passing, he quickly turned away. The guilt lingered, a heavy presence that refused to leave him. He wanted to apologize again, to show her that he had taken her words to heart, but he didn't know how to approach her without making things worse. Then one afternoon, as he was returning home from school, he saw her outside, tending to her garden. She noticed him, and for a moment, he considered running inside. But instead, she raised a hand in a brief wave. It wasn't an invitation to talk, but it wasn't cold either. It was acknowledgement, a small gesture that seemed to say she wasn't holding a grudge. Encouraged by that, the boy began to make small changes. He put more effort into respecting the people around him, paying attention to how he interacted with others. He realized he had always been observant, but he needed to channel that curiosity into something positive. He began sketching in a notebook, drawing scenes from the neighborhood, trying to capture the essence of what he saw without invading anyone's privacy. A few weeks later, she approached him unexpectedly. She caught him on the sidewalk, his sketchbook in hand, and asked what he was drawing. Caught off guard, he hesitated but then showed her. The page featured a simple sketch of a garden, not hers but inspired by the neighborhood. She studied it for a moment and smiled. It's good, she said. You've got an eye for details. The boy thanked her, feeling a mix of pride and relief. They stood in silence for a moment before she spoke again. You know, life isn't always as it seems from the outside. People go through things they don't always share, and that's okay. But it's also okay to care about people, as long as you respect their space. He nodded, understanding more now than he had before. I'm trying to be better, he said earnestly. I can see that, she replied. And that's what matters. The conversation was brief, but it left a lasting impression on him. It wasn't about erasing the past. It was about growing from it. From that day forward, their interactions were limited to polite hellos and occasional smiles. He no longer felt the need to watch her or understand every part of her life. For the boy, the experience marked a turning point. He had made a mistake, but he had learned from it. The world around him seemed different now, richer and more complex, and he was determined to approach it with greater care and respect. And though he still thought of her from time to time, it was no longer with a sense of mystery or longing. Instead, it was with gratitude for the lesson she had taught him, a lesson he would carry with him for the rest of his life.